She had been cleaning his house for 3 years before he learned her name. Not Ruby's name, he knew Ruby. Everyone knew Ruby Calloway. She was the kind of woman who made a house feel like somebody actually lived in it. She left the kitchen smelling like real food, not the cold, catered meals his staff usually arranged. She called him baby under her breath when she thought he wasn't listening, and pretended she hadn't when he turned around. Ruby he knew. It was the daughter he hadn't noticed. Her name was Josephine. Jo. She came on Saturdays, quiet as a change in weather, moving through the rooms of the Kang estate like she already understood its rhythms. She didn't stare at him the way visitors did, that particular mix of pity and curiosity that made him want to clear the room. She didn't look away either, performing some careful, exaggerated normalcy to prove she wasn't staring. She simply looked at him the way she looked at everything, directly, briefly, and with the calm of someone who had already decided what mattered and what didn't. He noticed her the day she corrected his Korean. He had been dictating a contract amendment to his assistant, his voice low and even, the words precise. She walked past the open study door with a laundry basket balanced against her hip. She slowed. She actually stopped. And then, without looking up, without breaking her stride more than that one small pause, she said it plain and unhurried, the way someone states a fact they assume everyone already knows. That clause won't hold. The precedent was overturned in 2019. He stared at the empty doorway. She was already gone. His assistant looked at him. He looked at the contract. He looked at the doorway again. Then he wheeled himself to the hall, but she had already turned the corner toward the kitchen, and the sound of Ruby's voice and her daughter's laughter floated back to him like something from a different world entirely. He returned to his desk. He read the clause again. She was right. By the following morning, the contract had been revised. He told his assistant it was a necessary correction. He did not mention where the correction had come from. Neither did anyone else. That was how it started, not with fire, not with drama, not with the kind of moment people later point to and say there. That's where it began. It began with a laundry basket and 4 words spoken to no one in particular by a woman who expected nothing back. He didn't know yet that she had been watching this house and the man who ran it for longer than that one Saturday morning. He didn't know what she had seen, what she had figured out, or what she was quietly building in the margins of her own life while everyone around her looked the other way. He only knew that she had walked past his open door, told him the truth without being asked, and kept moving. And Kang Iseul, who forgot nothing, filed it away. The story doesn't begin here, though. To understand what this is, you have to go back. Back to a high school hallway in Seoul. Back to 3 teenagers who were already playing a game with the rest of their lives and didn't know it yet. The hallways of Hanguk Preparatory were built to impress. Marble floors, tall windows, the kind of silence that came not from emptiness, but from students who had been taught since childhood that noise was a form of weakness. It was the kind of school where everybody's last name carried weight, and everybody knew it. Kang Iseul walked those halls like he had been born knowing the rules. He was 16, lean, and already serious in the way some boys get when the world has asked too much of them too soon. His uniform was always pressed. His grades were always first. He never laughed too loudly or said more than he needed to. The other students respected him the way people respect a storm, from a careful distance. Shin Daewon was the reason Iseul had ever laughed at all. They had been friends since the 3rd grade, which in the world of Seoul's elite families meant they had grown up in each other's houses, eaten at each other's dinner tables, and survived each other's worst moments. Daewon was everything Iseul wasn't built to be, loose-limbed and easy, quick with a smile that made teachers forget to be angry. He made the weight of the Kang name feel, for a few hours each day, like something Iseul could actually put down. Chae and Lim arrived in their 2nd year of high school. She walked in on a Tuesday, daughter of the Lim family, whose tech empire had just merged with half of Seoul's financial district. She was sharp-featured and quietly stunning, the kind of beautiful that didn't ask for attention but received it anyway. She sat 2 rows from Iseul in economics and answered the teacher's question on her first day with such clean, careful precision that the whole class went still. Iseul noticed her mind. That was what he would remember later, not her face, but the way she thought. What he didn't notice, what he never allowed himself to consider, was the way Dawan's eyes tracked her from the moment she walked through the door. Or the way she glanced back, just once, when she thought no one was watching. It was brief and specific, the kind of look that already has a history behind it, even when history hasn't happened yet. By the end of the semester, Dawan had found reasons to sit near her. By the end of the year, they had a language between them built from small things: a shared note, a look across a classroom, a laugh that started and stopped too quickly. They were careful. They were always careful. Iseul saw none of it. Meanwhile, in the large, warm kitchen of the Kang family estate across the city, Ruby Calloway was making dinner for a family that barely noticed her and a boy who pretended not to. She had worked there for 7 years by then. She knew where every creak in the floorboards was. She knew how Iseul took his tea, and that he never asked for it. He just appeared in the kitchen doorway and waited, which was his way of asking for everything he didn't know how to say out loud. She gave it to him every time. Some evenings her phone would ring, and her whole face would change, softer, louder, more herself. A voice from Georgia that filled the kitchen like sunlight. Her daughter. Iseul heard the laughter sometimes, passing through the hall. He never stopped to listen. But the sound of it stayed with him in the way some things do, quietly, without permission, like a song you didn't know you'd learned. He was 16. He didn't know yet what was being built around him, or what was being hidden, or that the girl laughing through his kitchen walls would one day be the most important person in his world. None of them knew what the game would cost. The dinner was held in the Kang family's formal dining room, which was the kind of room designed to make people feel the full weight of old money and older expectations. The table seated 20. Tonight it seated 8, but it felt smaller than that, compressed by the specific tension of 2 powerful families sitting across from each other, smiling with their mouths while their eyes did the real talking. Iseul sat straight and said the right things at the right moments. He was 17 and already excellent at this, the careful performance of a young man who understood his role and had made his peace with it. When the engagement was announced over the second course, he lifted his glass and nodded once, and the room interpreted his stillness as maturity. Nobody asked him how he felt. Nobody ever did. Chan sat beside him in a pale dress her mother had chosen. She was composed and lovely and said exactly enough. Her smile was practiced and perfect. Under the table, where the heavy linen cloth fell to the floor and nobody could see, her hands were pressed flat against her thighs, holding herself together with the concentrated effort of someone standing on the edge of something very high. Dawan was not at the dinner. He was parked 2 streets away in his father's car, his phone face up on the passenger seat, waiting. When Chan's message came through, 2 words, nothing more, he read it 3 times. Then he put the phone in his jacket pocket, started the engine, and drove. When she slipped out 20 minutes after the dinner ended, he was already there. She got in the car and didn't speak for a long time. He didn't push her. That was the thing about Dawan, he always knew when to wait. He could be endlessly patient when he wanted something, and he had wanted Chan since the day she walked into that economics class and answered a question like the rest of them weren't even in the room. "It's done," she finally said. "It's not done," he told her. "It's just not right now." She looked at him, and he said the thing he always said, the promise that felt true every single time he made it, even though it was built on nothing solid. She believed him. She had been believing him for over a year, and love makes believers out of even the most careful people. In the Kang kitchen that same evening, Ruby was washing the good dishes when her phone rang. Joe's voice burst through the speaker like warm weather. She'd graduated early. She had a job offer in Seoul. She was coming. Ruby laughed so fully that her whole body moved with it, and for a moment the kitchen was the brightest room in the house. Iseul passed the doorway. Heard her say, "Baby, this city is going to know your name." He paused. "Who is that?" Ruby smiled. "My daughter. She's something else, that girl." He nodded. Moved on. But he remembered it. Joe Calloway had heard about the Kang estate her whole life. Growing up in Georgia, the estate had existed in her imagination as a collection of her mother's details, the kitchen with the double oven, the library that smelled like cedar and old paper, the garden that nobody used, but everybody maintained. Ruby had described it the way some people describe a place they love despite themselves, with a particular mix of pride and quiet resignation. Standing in the actual hallway on an actual Saturday morning, Joe decided that no amount of description fully prepared you for how cold money looked in person. Everything was beautiful. Everything was precise. Nothing felt lived in except the kitchen, which smelled like her mother, which meant it smelled like home. She was 23, 8 weeks into a job at a downtown firm that paid her just enough to remind her daily what just enough felt like. She came to help Ruby with the heavy cleaning, the windows, the upper shelves, the things that required an extra pair of hands. She didn't come for the house. She came because Ruby always had food ready, and because an hour in her mother's company was worth the hour-long subway ride without question. She moved through the rooms without ceremony. She wasn't impressed or intimidated. She had spent enough time around people with power at her firm to know that the furniture was usually more interesting than the people who owned it. Then she passed the study. The door was open. She wasn't looking for anything. She was carrying a stack of folded linens and thinking about whether she'd remembered to pay her electric bill. But her eyes moved the way they always did, scanning, reading, processing without being asked to. The contract on the desk was face up. The clause was right there. She read it in 2 seconds the way she read everything, completely and without effort. She kept walking. She was 3 steps past the door when she stopped. Went back. Said it to the open room, not even sure he was fully listening. That clause won't hold. The precedent was overturned in 2019. Then she left. Ruby was already laughing about something when Joe reached the kitchen, and Joe dropped into a chair and accepted the plate her mother placed in front of her without ceremony, the way you only accept things from people who have been feeding you your whole life. She had almost forgotten the moment entirely when she heard the quiet hum of his wheelchair in the hallway. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, not entering, just present, and looked at her with the focused attention of someone recalibrating something. "Where did you study?" he asked. She told him. He asked what she studied. She told him that too. He nodded once, the way people nod when they're filing something away rather than responding to it, and disappeared back down the hall. Ruby said nothing, but her eyes were warm in a way that meant she had already seen something Joe hadn't yet. The contract was revised by morning. Neither of them mentioned it. Neither of them needed to. It wasn't one moment. It was 52 of them. One Saturday for every week of a year, each one small enough to dismiss and significant enough to remember. That was how it built, not with thunder, but with a steady, quiet accumulation of 2 people who kept showing up in the same space and slowly, without planning it, began to shape themselves around each other. It started with the books. Joe found them on her 3rd Saturday, a shelf in the library with annotated margins, his handwriting small and angular and relentlessly precise. She read his notes the way you read someone's private thoughts, because that's exactly what they were. The following week, she came back to the same shelf and added her own notes in a different color. "Blue pen is black." She didn't tell him. He didn't mention it. But the week after that, a new annotation had appeared directly beneath hers, a single line, arguing her point with the quiet confidence of someone who had been waiting for someone worth arguing with. They never discussed it. It simply continued. Then came the journals. Legal publications, dense and technical, began appearing on the kitchen counter on Saturday mornings. Too advanced for casual reading. Too specific to be accidental. Ruby would find them there and move them to the small table by the window where Joe always sat with her coffee, and neither woman said a word about where they'd come from. Ruby watched all of it with the particular satisfaction of someone who had planted a seed in good soil and had the patience to wait for rain. Kang Iseul's enforcer, a man built like a doorway and twice as solid, began appearing in the kitchen on Saturday afternoons with increasingly thin excuses. A question for Ruby about the supply order. A form that needed the household signature. Once, memorably, a sudden and urgent interest in whether Ruby's sweet potato recipe required a specific type of brown sugar. Ruby fed him every time and never once acknowledged the transparency of it. Joe found him deeply entertaining. He pretended not to notice her noticing. But beneath the warmth of those Saturdays, something else was taking shape. There was a dinner, one of Iseul's obligatory evenings with the families, Chaein seated at his right, Dowan across the table wearing his easy smile like a well-fitted jacket. Jo moved through the room with quiet efficiency, refilling glasses, replacing courses. She noticed everything, because she always did. Chaein watched Dowan the way people watch something they're afraid of losing. Dowan watched the estate the way people watch something they intend to take. Iseul watched Jo cross the room with something unnamed moving behind his eyes, there and gone before anyone could see it clearly. Jo watched Iseul and understood, with a slow, careful certainty she wasn't ready to name yet, that something in this house was already broken. And something else, something quieter and more stubborn, was just beginning to grow. The engagement dinner was the kind of event that got photographed from 12 different angles and remembered from only one. The room was full of the right people doing the right things, laughing at the right moments, lifting glasses at the right times, wearing expressions carefully calibrated to project warmth without revealing anything true. The Kang and Lim families sat at opposite ends of a table that cost more than most people's cars, united by alliance and separated by everything else. Iseul wore a dark suit and said very little, which everyone interpreted as dignity. Chaein wore ivory and smiled until her face must have ached with it. Jo was there because Ruby had asked her to help serve, an extra set of hands for a big evening. She moved through the room the way she always did, quiet and efficient and entirely overlooked by everyone who had decided before she walked in that she wasn't worth looking at. She was carrying a wide silver serving tray when it happened. She wasn't looking for anything. She was focused on keeping the tray level, navigating the narrow space between chairs, thinking about the next course. But the tray's polished surface caught the room like a mirror, and in that silver reflection, in that small curved world of reversed images and candlelight, she saw it. Dowan's hand, covering Chaein's beneath the table. Not a friendly gesture. Not accidental. A slow, deliberate press of fingers that carried the full weight of something long and private and deeply hidden. And then Chaein's face, just for a second, going soft in a way it never went when she looked at Iseul. Jo's eyes moved instinctively to Iseul's reflection. He had seen it too. Their eyes met in the surface of the tray, his dark and completely unreadable, hers wide with the shock of the moment. It lasted less than a second. He looked away first, back to the table, back to his glass, back to the performance of a man who felt nothing. He left an hour later. Drove himself, which he almost never did. The roads were dry. He knew every turn. Ruby's phone rang at 2 a.m. Jo was asleep on her mother's couch when she heard Ruby's voice change, that specific shift from confusion to something thicker and harder to name. Jo sat up before Ruby had finished the sentence. The car had gone off the embankment. The brake failure was mechanical, the initial report said. An accident. These things happened. Yosomi didn't believe it. Jo could see it on the older woman's face the following morning at the hospital, that tight, controlled fury of someone who already knew the shape of the truth and was simply collecting evidence to prove it. Jo stood in the hospital corridor and looked through the glass at Iseul lying completely still and felt something move through her that she had no clean word for. Not pity. Not fear. Something older and more complicated than either. Ruby sat beside her and held her hand without asking why she needed it. Neither of them slept that night. Kang Iseul did not recover gracefully. He recovered the way he did everything completely, privately, and on his own terms. The rehabilitation doctors used words like adjustment and adaptation and new normal, and Iseul listened to all of it with the polite, empty attention of a man who had already decided that none of their language applied to him. He was not adjusting. He was rebuilding. There was a difference, and it mattered to him in a way he couldn't have explained and didn't try to. He dismantled his entire operation and put it back together from the wheelchair with a cold, focused precision that unsettled even his most senior men. Phone calls at 5 a.m. Restructured supply chains. 3 mid-level managers quietly replaced before anyone understood why. He moved differently now, literally and in every other sense, But the reach of him, the weight of him, remained exactly what it had always been. Perhaps more. Ruby was one of the only people he allowed near him during those months. She didn't treat him differently, which was the one thing he could not have stood. She brought food he hadn't asked for and left it where he would find it, and never once looked at him with the specific softness that meant someone was deciding he was diminished. She simply continued, and in continuing, gave him something he had no word for. Joe came every Saturday. She didn't reference the accident. She didn't reference the wheelchair. She didn't reference any of it, which wasn't the same as ignoring it. It was more deliberate than that, more considered. She simply walked back into the rhythms they had built over the previous year as though the rhythms still held, because she had decided they did. She annotated his books. She drank coffee at the kitchen window. She debated case law from the doorway of a study with the calm confidence of someone who had earned the right to her own opinions and knew it. One Saturday he told her, without looking up from his desk, that she was wasting herself at her firm. She said she was aware. He said he had a legal matter that might interest her. She said she had a rate. He named a number. She looked at him with the quiet patience of someone who found his opening offer mildly amusing and named a higher one. He agreed without hesitation. Later, she would understand that the speed of his agreement told her more about how he valued her than anything he had said in a year of Saturdays. But that understanding came later. In the moment, she simply wrote down the case details he slid across the desk and went back to the kitchen, where Ruby was making the specific face she made when she was trying very hard not to be visibly pleased. Then came the photograph. A news site published it on a Thursday morning. Cheon and Dowan, photographed leaving a restaurant in Gangnam, her hand in his, both of them wearing the careful, assembled expressions of people who had planned to be seen. The accompanying statement used words like unexpected connection and difficult, but honest decision. It described the broken engagement as mutual. It described their relationship as something that had developed naturally, recently, without intention. 6 months after the accident. Joe read it on her phone on the subway and felt a hot, clean anger rise through her chest that she swallowed back down before it reached her face. She was getting good at that. Iseul read it in the morning papers and said nothing at all. But that night Ruby found him in the unlit study at midnight, the newspaper folded on the desk beside him, his medication untouched. She didn't turn the lights on. She didn't say a word. She simply pulled a chair close and sat with him in the dark, the way you sit with someone when language has reached its limit and presence is the only thing left that's true. He didn't send her away. That was how she knew how badly he was hurting. The pressure came quietly, the way most dangerous things did in Iseul's world. It wasn't a single conversation or a formal complaint. It was a shift in temperature, the way certain men on the Syndicate Council held eye contact a beat too long in meetings or asked questions that weren't really questions. Yosomi cataloged every instance with her usual precision and brought the full picture to Iseul on a Tuesday evening, laying it out across his desk with the calm efficiency of someone delivering a weather report about a storm that was already on its way. The council's concern, stripped of its careful language, was simple. A leader without a partner suggested instability. Instability suggested weakness. Weakness, in their world, was an open door. Iseul listened to all of it without expression. When Somi finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he asked, in the same tone he used for everything level unhurried, giving nothing away, who is making the most noise? Somi told him. He nodded once and said he would handle it. She left without asking how, because she had worked for him long enough to know that how was never the part he shared in advance. What happened next, nobody witnessed except Ruby. It was a Thursday morning. Ruby was moving through the study, straightening and dusting with the unhurried rhythm of someone who knew every surface in the room by heart. She had carried something in her pocket since the previous Saturday, a photograph, printed small, the edges slightly worn from being handled. Joe's law school graduation. Joe in her cap and gown, chin up, laughing at something off camera, looking like exactly what she was, someone who had worked for everything she had and arrived at it with her whole self intact. Ruby placed it in the center of Iseul's desk. She didn't say anything. She finished her dusting and left the room. Iseul found it when he returned from his morning calls. He sat with it for a long time. By Saturday, he was waiting in the hallway when Joe arrived. Not the kitchen. Not the study. The hallway, which meant he had positioned himself deliberately, which meant he had thought about this, which meant more than he would ever say out loud. Joe noticed all three of these things in the first 2 seconds and kept her face exactly as it always was. He spoke without preamble, the way he did everything. I have a proposal. A legal arrangement, 2 years, fully documented, with clear exit terms on both sides. He held her gaze steadily. You would have access to my firm's full legal resources for your career. In return, I need a wife who can stand in a room full of people who want me dead and not flinch. A pause that lasted exactly long enough. I've seen you not flinch. Joe looked at him. The hallway was quiet around them, morning light coming through the tall window at the end of the corridor, falling across the floor between them like something that hadn't decided which side it belonged to yet. She thought about the corrected clause. The annotated books. The legal journals left on the kitchen counter. The number he had agreed to without hesitating. The photograph of him in the unlit study that she hadn't seen but somehow knew the shape of anyway. She thought about her mother, who had spent 22 years in this house loving people who mostly forgot to notice. She thought about herself and what she was worth and what she was willing to accept as a definition of that. I'll need to see the contract, she said. Something moved across his face. It was small and fast and gone almost before it arrived, but it was there, and Joe saw it, and it was the closest thing to undone she had ever witnessed from a man who had made an art form of being untouchable. In the kitchen, Ruby stood very still with both hands pressed flat against the counter. She didn't say a word to anyone. She didn't need to. The wedding was small and documented and exactly what it needed to be. No celebration. No sentiment. A legal ceremony with 2 witnesses, Yosomi, who signed the register with the expression of someone completing a risk assessment, and Ruby, who cried quietly into a handkerchief she had brought specifically because she had known she would need it. Joe moved into the east wing of the estate the following weekend with 2 suitcases and her law books, which outnumbered everything else she owned by a significant margin. She unpacked with the same unhurried efficiency she brought to everything, organized her books by subject along the shelf Iseul had cleared without being asked, and went to help Ruby with dinner as though nothing had fundamentally changed. Everything had fundamentally changed. The Syndicate watched her the way predators watch something new entering their territory, with still, calculating attention that pretended to be casual. At the first gathering she attended on Iseul's arm, she felt the weight of 30 different assessments happening simultaneously. Too young. Wrong family. Wrong country. Wrong everything, by their calculations. She wore a dark dress and stood beside Iseul's chair and spoke when spoken to and observed everything, and gave them nothing to work with, which unsettled them more than any performance could have. Yosomi watched her most closely of all. She ran background checks so thorough they covered Joe's undergraduate library fines and her Georgia middle school attendance record. She reviewed every case Joe had worked at her firm, every client interaction, every documented decision. She stationed herself at angles in rooms where she could watch Joe's face during difficult conversations without being obvious about it. Joe knew she was being watched. She didn't adjust a single thing, which was either the behavior of someone with nothing to hide or someone with everything under control. Somi couldn't yet determine which. What the Syndicate saw was a quiet, composed woman who stood where she was placed and caused no disruption. What it didn't see was Joe at midnight in the study. She had started with the files Iseul left accessible, standard Syndicate business, nothing sensitive. But Joe had a lawyer's habit of following threads, and threads had a way of leading places when you were patient enough to follow them without rushing. Dowen's name appeared in peripheral documents with a frequency that didn't match his official role. Shell companies registered to addresses that didn't exist. Financial movements timed to specific events in the Syndicate's history. She built her own file in a locked drawer, one piece at a time. The first night Iseul found her there, it was past 1 a.m. He said nothing immediately, just wheeled himself to the desk and looked at what she had spread across the surface with the focused attention of someone who understood exactly what they were seeing. He pulled his chair alongside hers and asked what she had found. She told him. All of it. Clearly and in order. He listened without interrupting, which was how she knew he was taking it seriously. 3 weeks later, he fell asleep in his chair during a late working session, his head tilted slightly, the tension he carried in his jaw finally released by exhaustion into something that looked almost peaceful. Jo closed the files. She lifted his jacket from the back of the chair and placed it carefully across his shoulders. She turned the desk lamp to its lowest setting and left the room without a sound. He woke an hour later to specific darkness and specific warmth and knew immediately, with a certainty that required no evidence, exactly what she had done. He sat with that knowledge for a long time before he went to bed. Across the city, in an apartment that cost more than it should have, Chaein lay awake listening to Dowen's breathing and thinking about the fact that he had lied to her twice that week about where he had been. Small lies, smoothly delivered. She had believed them both in the moment. She was becoming less sure she believed them now. She stared at the ceiling and thought about a lot of things she wasn't yet ready to say out loud, in the specific, exhausting way of someone who has begun to understand something they very much wish they hadn't. It was a Wednesday, which was important only because Wednesday was the day Ruby went to the market. She had gone to the same market for 19 years, same route, same vendors, same hour of the morning when the fish was freshest and the vegetable sellers were still in a good enough mood to give her the prices she'd long ago established as non-negotiable. Everyone there knew her. The woman with the warm laugh and the careful eye and the Korean that had improved steadily over 2 decades until it carried only the faintest trace of Georgia in its edges. She didn't come home that Wednesday. Lim Kil-soo appeared in the study doorway at 11:15 with an expression Jo had never seen on his face before. He was a man who had been in rooms where terrible things happened and had remained completely composed throughout. But standing in that doorway, he looked like someone who had swallowed something sharp and was trying not to show it. He told Jo first. She wasn't sure why, perhaps because Iseul was on a call, perhaps because some instinct told him that Jo needed a second to prepare before the information reached the room where decisions got made. She stood very still while he spoke. Not the stillness of shock. Something different. Something that moved inward rather than outward, all of her energy pulling toward a single, quiet center while the surface of her remained completely calm. Kil-soo watched her face and understood, in that moment, exactly why Iseul had chosen her. The message was straightforward. Dowen's voice on a recorded line, unhurried and almost pleasant, the way his voice always was when he was most dangerous. Public abdication of the Syndicate leadership. Documented and announced before Friday. Or Ruby Calloway did not come home from her Wednesday market. Iseul ended his call. Jo walked into the study and closed the door behind her. She looked at him for a moment, just a moment, and in that look was everything she wasn't going to say, all the fear and fury compressed into something too dense and too private for words. Then she crossed to his desk and opened the bottom left drawer. The one she had never mentioned to him. She placed the file on the desk in front of him. It was thick. Organized with the clean, careful precision of someone trained to build cases that held up under pressure. Tab sections. Documented sources. A financial trail so clearly constructed that a first-year law student could follow it to its conclusion without assistance. She placed her hand flat on top of it and looked at him directly. "This is enough to walk Dowen into a Korean federal courtroom," she said. Her voice was even. "It's been enough for 3 weeks. I was waiting until I had the chairman too." A pause. Short and absolute. "I have the chairman." Iseul looked at the file. He looked at her hand on top of it. He looked at her face, at the steadiness of it, the complete and unperformed calm of a woman who had been quietly preparing for this moment while everyone around her assumed she was simply learning the rhythms of a new household. The room was very quiet. Outside, Seoul moved through its Wednesday with no idea what was sitting on a desk in the Kang estate or what it was about to dismantle. Iseul reached out and opened the file. He read in silence for 4 minutes. Jo stood and waited because she knew what he would find and didn't need to walk him through it. She had built it to speak for itself. When he looked up, something had shifted in his face. Not dramatically, he was not a dramatic man. But something that had been locked was fractionally less locked, and Joe, who had been studying that face for 3 years, saw it clearly. He had spent 2 years believing that trust was the thing that had put him in this wheelchair. She had just handed him the evidence that the right kind of trust, careful, patient, and built on 3 years of annotated books and corrected contracts and Wednesday market mornings, was also the thing that was going to get his mother figure home safely. He didn't say thank you. That wasn't his language. He picked up his phone and called Yosomi, and the precision with which he delivered instructions told Joe everything she needed to know about what happened next. She pulled the chair beside his desk and sat down. She wasn't going anywhere. Ruby came home before dawn. Kyosu made the call at 4:47 in the morning, 3 words, nothing more, and Joe, who had not slept, who had spent the night in the study chair with case files in her lap and her phone face up on the desk, closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds when she heard them. Then she stood up, straightened her clothes, and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on, because Ruby would want tea when she arrived and Joe needed something to do with her hands. Yosomi had coordinated the retrieval with the quiet, surgical efficiency of someone who had been waiting for an operation this clean her entire career. No casualties on their side. 2 of Down's men in federal custody. Ruby, unhurt, wrapped in a blanket in the back of Kyosu's car, apparently having told her captor at some point during the night that his mother would be ashamed of him, which Kyosu reported with something very close to admiration. The federal case moved quickly after that. Joe's paperwork was immaculate. Every charge supported by 3 independent sources. Every financial trail documented from origin to destination with no gaps and no assumptions, only evidence. Dowen's lawyers were expensive and fast and found absolutely nothing to work with, which was not an accident. Joe had built the case specifically to survive the best legal defense money could buy, because she had known from the beginning that money was the one thing Dowen would never run out of. He was taken on a Thursday morning, which felt right somehow, Thursdays being the day Ruby always said the week finally decided what it was going to be. The chairman fell 3 days later. Ryu Byung-soo, who had spent 30 years being the hand behind every hand in Seoul's underworld, met the end of his operation in the form of a 26-year-old Black American woman's meticulously organized legal file, which was the kind of ending nobody in his world had ever thought to prepare for. Chain came in from the cold on her own. When the full picture was laid in front of her, the break lines, the planned progression of Dowen's takeover, the specific and deliberate way she had been used as cover for years, she sat in her car outside the federal building for a long time. Long enough that a parking officer approached and then thought better of it when he saw her face. Then she got out of the car and walked inside. It was the first decision she had made entirely for herself in as long as she could remember. It was uncomfortable and correct and long overdue, which described most of the best decisions Joe had ever seen people make. The Syndicate Council met 4 days after Dowen's arrest. Iseul spoke briefly. He explained, without drama or emphasis, that the largest internal conspiracy in the organization's history had been identified, documented, and delivered to federal authorities by his wife, using public records and a law degree. He named no specific actions she had taken. He simply laid out the outcome, clearly and completely, and then stopped talking. The silence in that room lasted a long time. Nobody asked about his legs. That evening the estate was quieter than usual and fuller than it had been in years. Ruby was in the kitchen making the specific dish she only made when something was genuinely worth celebrating, the recipe she'd brought from Georgia and never written down because she said some things needed to live in the hands rather than on paper. The smell of it moved through every room of the house like an announcement. Kyosu sat at the kitchen counter on his usual stool, eating whatever Ruby placed in front of him with the focused appreciation of a man who understood he was exactly where he was supposed to be. He did not mention that he had been frightened. He didn't need to. Ruby knew, and that was enough for both of them. Yosomi appeared in the hallway outside the study at 8:30. Joe was passing through with a cup of tea and nearly walked into her. Somi looked at her with the direct, assessing gaze that had initially made Joe feel like a specimen being catalogued. Then she said, simply and without decoration, "You did good." She walked away before Joe could respond, which was almost certainly intentional. Joe stood in the hallway for a moment, holding her tea, and allowed herself, privately, briefly, to feel the full weight of what that meant from that particular woman. Then she walked to the study window and stood looking out at Seoul. The city was bright and enormous and entirely indifferent, the way cities always are. But Jo had learned something about indifferent things, that they became less indifferent when you understood them well enough, when you had followed their patterns patiently and taken careful note of what they revealed and built something solid from what you found. She heard him before she saw him. The quiet hum of his chair in the hallway. The soft sound of it stopping in the doorway behind her. He didn't speak immediately. That was his way, he never used words to fill space. He only used them when they were the right ones. "Stay," he said finally. She waited. Because she knew there was more, and because she had learned that the most important things he said always came after the first word, in the space where most people would have already stopped. Not for the contract. Not for the house. A pause that held the weight of 2 years of annotated books and midnight study sessions and a jacket laid across sleeping shoulders. Not for your mother, though she would take this kitchen apart brick by brick if you left. His voice dropped to the register she had heard only once before, in the dark study, in the silence after something hard had passed between them and left the air cleaner. For me. Jo looked at Seoul for one more moment. Then she turned. She looked at him the way she had looked at him in the silver tray's reflection on the night everything broke, directly, briefly, and with the particular calm of someone who had already made their decision and was simply allowing the world to catch up to it. "I already am," she said. From the kitchen, Ruby's voice rose quietly into the warm air of the estate, an old song, half remembered, the kind that lived in the body rather than the mind. She didn't sing loudly. She didn't need to. It reached every room anyway.